What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel that helps animals and another Tarkovology video. Today we have an Escape from Tarkov Weapon Tier Maker for 12.12.30. Ours is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to separate each tier into categories, pistols, assault rifles, etc., so that it can be a little bit more fairly rated between each weapon. And on top of that, we're going to approach it with more of a cost to lethality ratio rather than just overall effectiveness and omitting cost completely like a lot of these streamers do. One thing to keep in mind, guys, is that these tier lists are always subjective to a player's preference. So, I'm no different than anybody else. My playstyle is not exactly the same as everybody else's, just like yours probably isn't. So we're going to have a difference of opinion on some of these things. And if you feel like talking about it, shoot it down in the comments below. I love talking about Tarkov with people, and I'm very responsive in the comments. So feel free to tell me I'm wrong, and we'll talk about it. So with that, let's get straight into it, and we're going to start with the pistols. The CR200DS, it's a meme gun. It's cute. It's cute, but it's a meme gun. The Makarov, threaded or not threaded, doesn't matter. 9x18 is a horrible caliber, especially when you only have 8 rounds. Some argument to be made if you have the drum mag, but yeah, for the most part, the Makarov is something that's going to get you killed quite frequently if you field it. No exception with the suppressor on it. That's also going to be a do not use tier. The gold TT, you really shouldn't be using this because you need to turn it in later for a quest. But on top of that, the 7.62x25 round is pretty horrible, especially when you only have as few rounds as its TT provides you with, so do not use this either. Starting in the C tier, we've got the APS. I know I said 9x18 isn't great, but this gun performs a little bit better than the other pistols in that realm, but it also has an additional high capacity magazine for it, doing 20 rounds instead of 8. It's a little bit different if you can run an ammo like, say, PBM or something like that. This gun isn't horrible. It's still not going to use it very often, if at all, but it is a little bit better than the Makarovs and the PB. Coming in above that, pretty much every 9mm available in Tarkov is going to have a very similar performance. The differences in these being cost, attachments, magazine size, etc. They're all firing roughly at the same recoil levels and this sort of thing, so there really isn't a huge difference between any of these 9mm, so they all get ranked in the same tier, which is subpar at best. The APB is actually not a bad gun. Once you put that stock on it, it does bring the recoil down, and the ability to full auto this thing makes it a little bit better than any of the C tier pistols, even though it is firing that 9x18 round. When you can when you can get rid of all those bullets within a matter of a half a second, it changes the game slightly. It's still not great, but it's solid B tier. The revolver here, it's hard for me to put this in the B tier. The 357 rounds aren't like super bad. You just have to make sure you're firing at double action, so you actually do have to change that fire mode. And then this gun is not that bad. Those rounds don't do as much penetration as I would hope they would have done, but that might change in the future. This gun is pretty new, so Nikita might give this gun a buff. It's a lot of fun to use. It gets it some extra points as well. As far as the rest of the A tier, I am going to put the boomer cannons up here. I really like 45 AP, but the cost increase kind of hurt it a little bit, and you can only get 11 rounds into these mags at most, so that it is a bit of a hindrance. The USP, I'm going to place it in the same tier, the A tier, mainly because 45 caught a little bit of a nerf with that cost increase, and also the size of the magazines available for these weapons. Compared to, say, something like the 5.7, for example, higher capacity mag, cheaper ammunition, slightly better pistol all around as far as like recoil performance goes, this sort of thing. The iron sights are much better on this weapon, so this is our first S tier weapon. The shrimp can be very good and is a comparable weapon to the 5.7. At this point in time, you're probably not running pistols for anything other than fun runs or night runs or scav killing dailies or something like that. But if you do have to use one, I would recommend one of those two, or if you really want to have some fun, the Glock 18 with a 50 rounder can be a pretty rewarding experience, assuming that you're using a decent ammunition. I mean, honestly, even if you're using PST, if you throw 50 rounds at something, there's a decent chance it's going to die anyway. These 3 round out are S tier. If I had to say, one might not belong here, the Glock 18 is kind of dependent on the ammo type you're using. It's more of like an A+. but it's a hell of a lot of fun, so I bumped it up to the S tier. Moving on to sniper rifles, there's 2 guns that belong in the do not use tier, and again, just keep in mind this is purely for what a sniper rifle is best at, and that's long range sniping. The break action obviously fires a single shot, and it is not flexible at all. That's why this is here. It's mostly a meme gun. Mosin Infantry is simply here because you can't attach optics to it. So as a sniper rifle, it is not great. I ran the crap out of this gun early wipe, to get my bolt action skill up, but that's not what this tier maker is about. Differentiating between the sniper rifles is pretty difficult because the differences between them are mainly, based on the bullet they're running and subtle differences in ergo, some things like that. And this one's largely a matter of just personal preference based on playstyle. So the DVL, I'm going to put in the B tier only because of its cost. I like the gun, I like using the gun, but compared to something like an M700, if you're just trying to get tasks done or something like that, it just doesn't seem that cost effective to me, and the cost doesn't make me feel like I'm any more powerful than, say, running an Ursus or an M700, and that's the same caliber weapon. So moving from there, I will put the M700 in the B tier as well. This one can get very good, and in fact, it could get into the A tier, but it requires so many attachments to do so. Again, it becomes kind of a cost-related issue. Whereas with the Ursus, you don't have to put anything on this weapon. The recoil and the ergo stats are very similar to what a kitted M700 would be. It's not quite as good, but it's definitely comparable. And little known fact, when you switch over magnification levels on sights with the Ursus, you don't actually make noise. You don't hear it on your player, the other players don't hear it, so if you're trying to be sneaky, that's a nice little function that not too many people know about. Coming into the A tier is the Gore Nasty. This gun is dirt cheap, the ammo is cheap, it hits like a Mack truck unless you're very far away. This is a very good gun if you're trying to be cost effective about your kits. Last wipe this would have been in a B tier because of the trajectory on the ammo. It's far more arcing because it's only 750 or so meters per second. But with the changes to the ballistics lately, I do believe this is an A tier weapon. Its cost is good, its ergo is good. It's all around a pretty solid choice. Unless you're doing extremely long range sniping, this is a pretty well-rounded weapon for you to use. The SV98 actually came up a tier as well. That new SV98 available from Jaeger pretty much kicked it right into this category. It's cheap, ergo's high. It basically took all of the weaknesses of the previous SV98, slow, clunky, this sort of thing, and really kind of tuned it up a little bit. Combine that with the fact that you can shoot a 54R, any of those bullets is just absolutely devastating. So it's a great gun to use for any sniping tasks or just PvP. The Mosin, I'm kind of torn with this one, but it still feels, unless you heavily modify it, it still feels very clunky to me. I've taken a few of them out. I'll put the 514mm barrel on them and the Monte Carlo stock, and I feel like you don't sacrifice enough accuracy to really harm the weapon. So it's kind of between S and A tier when you modify it to preference. So I guess I'm going to leave this in the A tier for now, but just know that this is a tough choice. This weapon can kind of float between either based on the bullet it uses, how accurate it is, this sort of thing. Of course, the Lapua, it's not hard to put anything that shoots Lapua in S tier, but let's face it, the cost on this weapon is ridiculous. The ammo is ridiculous. So I'm going to put it as an A tier as opposed to an S tier, just based on availability, accessibility, and cost. All right, moving on to shotguns, everybody's favorite. The Taz is a meme gun, always has been, probably always will be. The MP133 isn't good for anything but handing quests in. The M870 is absolute dog water. The Mossberg is not that great. It was used very briefly when it first came out, but pretty quickly discovered that it just wasn't that good. In fact, I would argue that the revolver shotgun is better. The double barrel is actually pretty potent, assuming that you can actually land those 2 shots. This thing can really put some hurt hard on some people, and it doesn't really take that long to reload those 2 slugs. The Benelli, it's kind of back and forth between B and A tier, but I do think the Benelli finishes in the A tier. The 155 is actually pretty good, just requires a lot of attachments to be very good. So it is the A tier as opposed to S tier, but it is very close here. It's just the cost involved when compared to the other S tier shotguns is really the only deterrent for me. KS-23, I mean, if you've ever toyed around with this shotgun, it's absolutely brutal. You have to be very close range for it to work, but if you are within that range, this thing can really shred some people, pretty much regardless of what gear they're wearing. The MP-153, I mean, this is the tried and true. This is what everybody ends up using to do setup or silent caliber, this sort of thing, you know, and 70% of the streamers out there right now finish those quests with this gun. So, you know, that to me speaks volumes. It's still the king of the hill in terms of just overall, you know, flexibility and this sort of thing. And a runner up to that would probably be the Saiga. The Saiga can come with a drum mag, you know, or you can just do the really long extended mag that you need a 3-slot rig for. Either of those is great. You do need some extra rounds in this thing, and that's kind of one of the weaknesses of this weapon, is if you use the 5-round mags, they're gone in a heartbeat, and you've probably missed at least a few of those shells just because of the massive amount of recoil in this gun unless you trick it out. So it's kind of like the Benelli in the sense that the cost sometimes outweighs the functionality, especially when you compare it to, say, the 153, but this performs, in my opinion, better than the Benelli, at least currently. All right, moving on to DMRs. To preface this particular section, I don't think there's any such thing as a bad DMR in Escape from Tarkov, just the nature of the game, the distances of, you know, normal engagements, and the necessity for armor penetration, this sort of thing. At this stage in the wipe, there really isn't a bad DMR. So the main differences between these tiers is going to be cost, and, you know, basically overall effectiveness in terms of ergo differences, recoil differences, this sort of thing. But all of these are good choices, assuming that you already have them or you can afford them. Probably the bottom of the barrel right now is the G28. This thing performs very well, but it's very expensive. It just isn't worth fielding over something else that, say, uses the same caliber, simply because of the cost to its performance ratio. Down there with it, unfortunately, is going to be the M1A. I love this gun. I love the sound it makes. I ran the M1 for my first couple of wipes a very long time ago, but this gun has really kind of struggled to keep up in terms of its stats. Even with the SASS kit, it's kind of just mediocre compared to, you know, some of the other guns in this category. So it's a sad day, but that's where it is. The RFB, probably going to catch some shit for this, but I know every other streamer pretty much puts this S tier because they spend, you know, I don't know, 100 interchange raids hunting killer with it. But in my opinion, this is an A tier weapon. You know, if we're rating it against all the other guns in Tarkov, like they always do, then is it S tier? Yeah, probably, because it's so cheap. It's very effective for the price you're paying for it. But in my opinion, compared to the other DMRs, you know, you can spend just a little bit more money, not much, and get a much better weapon out of, say, an SR25. You're not talking about an exorbitant sum of money that you have to pay in addition to get a hold of this weapon at this point in the wipe, and it's going to perform much better for you, which is why this is in the S tier. Additionally, the SVD, this is a little more expensive than the SR25, especially if you are getting into the meta builds, but the performance you get out of the 7.62x54 round is just insane. You know, pretty much any round you put into this gun from that caliber is going to be devastating to most players at any stage of the wipe. So that being said, even if you run it stock, it's still very effective. Once you start modifying it, it becomes a real monster. The RSASS, you know, the main thing that prevents this gun from being more widely used is simply the cost. But, you know, if you find one in Mark Room or you find one in a weapons crate or something and you start using it, you really do get an idea of just how powerful this weapon is. But again, you know, cost probably knocks it down from S tier to A tier. And of course, you know, the Lapua, which you have to unlock, you know, it's easy to put this in S tier in terms of performance. It's kind of a no-brainer. I don't, it's whatever. Nobody's ever going to use this thing except for streamers. or people having a 1 out of every 100 raid and they just want to play with it and never spend that much money on it again. It's not a practical weapon. Is it fun? Absolutely, but it's just not something that any reasonable human being is going to field more than a few raids here and there. All right, we're going to move on to assault carbines. I've actually taken the liberty of moving a few guns out of the assault category, which are semi-auto. The reason being, I don't really feel it's fair to compare some of these semi-auto weapons to assault rifles, and for some reason the game categorizes them as assault rifles. Like for example, the TX-15, the VPO 209 1-6, the 8R, the AK-545. That's the new SAG AK, and those I've kind of bumped down into this category because they perform more similar to these particular weapons. So I think it's more fair to rank them against them. So starting off with the TX-15, 5.56 has gotten buffed recently. So this has kind of been moving around a little bit lately with the nerfs and buffs that 8.55A1 is taking. But it still just doesn't have enough punch to justify using 5.56 in a semi-auto platform, in my opinion, at this stage in the wipe. Plus the cost is also prohibitive. The VPO, the 209, and the 136, when compared to other assault carbines, both of these I believe are A tier. Let me explain why. So one is 7.62x39, which the recent buff to PS rounds makes a budget assault carbine amazing. You can take down anything with class 4 armor. You have a decent fighting chance against class 5, and this thing just puts out a lot of damage, assuming that you can hit your shots, right? So the 3.66 caliber, anything with AP in there is going to perform very well also. So I will put an asterisk on that particular VPO, because if you're trying to run it with EKO or something like that, just don't do it. But if you have access to AP, that turns this thing into a whole different monster. The recoil is a little out of control, but you have basically the same thing as a Gornasty, but you're firing it semi-auto, so it's something to take into consideration. The 8R is tough for me to grade because at the beginning of the wipe, this gun is really, really good, especially with the buffs to 8.55. And again, I know I just said that the TX-15 is a B tier, and I'm going to put this right next to the TX-15 just for that reason. Semi-auto, 5.56, mid to late wipe, it's just a no-go. It's going to get you killed more often than not, unless you're very good, or it's a very situational weapon. Mid to long range, fine, that's okay, but it's not flexible in my opinion right now. And the damage, like for example, the damage from 7.62 or 3.66 being much greater, kind of outclasses these two, and that's why they're down here. Moving on to everybody's favorite, the SKS. This I'm actually going to put in do not use unless you're running a budget kit. The 7.62x39, as I just said, is very powerful, but you can't attach anything to this particular variety of SKS. So unless it's the very beginning of the wipe, by all means field it then. The iron sights are absolutely dog shit, so if you can deal with that, this is a great cheap weapon to use. I can't stand the iron sights personally, but the bullet it fires makes this probably a B tier weapon in the beginning of wipe, but right now it's at the very bottom. It's pretty much garbage at this point in the wipe. The OPSKS, this actually has a very good hidden recoil stat. Its dispersion is one of the lowest in the game, along with the SKS, but can't attach anything again. And it can shoot the same bullet as this VPO. So you can also get extended magazines for this. So if I were to rate this any lower than this VPO, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to put this in the A tier because of its recoil stat. The recoil number might look bigger than you would expect, but because that number has a lower dispersion attached to it, it's a little bit better than one would think. So the OPSKS with the right attachments, a stock attachment and some optics, along with a suppressor, can actually do some pretty decent damage in this semi-auto category. The Hunter is pretty difficult to place because it feels very clunky, but the round it fires is very powerful. It has a very limited capacity magazine, and it has a very high recoil, even with some modifications. So I'm leaving this in A tier. If you were to spend quite a bit of money on modifying this, then it could potentially be S tier, kind of similarly to the SKS. But as it stands, most people aren't going to field this as a meta weapon, or in its meta form, I should say. So it's going to remain in the A tier for now. That brings us to the 5.45 shorts and the AK 5.45. 5.45, I believe, is in a really bad spot right now in this wipe, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the assault rifle category. I do believe that 545 needs a little bit of a buff, similar to 556, and it'll probably get it. You know, your only ammo choices, which are BT, BS, and a Golnick, really lack the punch in terms of flesh damage to make a semi-automatic rifle viable. So that's these things are great. They have a really high ergo. Their recoil is almost non-existent compared to every single gun in this platform. You can get those numbers really low with a minimal amount of attachments, but the bullet just doesn't do any damage. You know, you'll hit a guy 4 or 5 times before he drops. Sometimes if you miss your headshot, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now you're probably saying, well, there's no S tier weapon on here, and you're right, there is not. There really shouldn't be any reason to run any of these, in my opinion, at least not at this point in the wipe. There's really no reason to run these over, say, a DMR, an assault rifle, or something of that nature. So, you know, if these guns are in fact the type of weapons you prefer, then I would stick to something in the A tier for sure. But yeah, I can't put anything in the S tier here. I just can't do it. Moving on to SMGs, they've actually gotten a pretty decent buff in this patch, so we're seeing quite a few of them out there, and they can make close quarters combat really interesting. So starting off the MP9N, I just don't see the point in using this in anywhere other than factory, and even if you're in factory, there are so many better guns to run. You know, following that up with the MP9, we'll give that a solid C. But yeah, these two weapons are just really underwhelming. 9mm is not in a great spot overall for SMGs or pistols for that matter. I know they made AP rounds purchasable, which is good, but the cost on the AP rounds is almost identical to 45 AP, which is ridiculous. So, you know, I'm not going to treat 9mm very favorably in this category. Just be forewarned. It just is what it is. So the STM9 probably shouldn't be considered an SMG. Probably should have put it in the assault carbine tier. But even in the assault carbine tier, this and the Saiga 9 are both going to be at the bottom of the list. You know, they're not full auto. You could make an argument for the STM9 to probably be C tier here, just because you can turn this thing into like a 24 recoil laser. So we'll bump him up a tiny bit. But again, you know, it's reliant on 9mm and it's semi-auto, so you know it's got two things working against it. All of the Ketters are absolute dog shit. I'll die on that hill. It's 9x18 again. You've got a small mag. The only thing that separates the Ketter B is the suppressor. You know, the recoil stats, the hidden recoil stats, the dispersion stats, they're not good enough to make this gun anything other than a leg meta gun, and leg meta guns will get you got in a lot of different situations. The MP5K, this is absolutely only used in emergencies only. It's similar to the MP9 in that there are just so many other better options once you get a little bit further into the vendor trees. You know, is it okay at level 1? Sure. You know, as long as you've got a 30 round mag in there, it's okay. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't be fielding this in any serious situations. The PPSH, it's pretty solid early game. You know, our level 1 weapon video was recommending that you use this at the start of the wipe, and you know, it's just a bullet hose. It's basically what it is. And if you take a look at the recoil on the ammo, the two best ammo types, push this into the B tier. Okay, it's dirt cheap. You can buy drum mags, and that recoil stat on that ammo, which is -12 and -15, I believe, for the LRN and the LRN PC, make this gun a B tier. The PP19 is highly modifiable. You can put anything you can put on AK on this, basically, which is part of the only reason it gets into the B tier as a 9mm SMG. It does have a subpar fire rate. You're only shooting at 650 rounds per minute, which is pretty slow for a 9mm, but it still isn't semi-auto. So it'll just sit in B tier. It might be a B-, but it's there. The Vector I'm putting in the A tier. This is probably the best 9mm SMG. You can walk in without any attachments at all with this weapon and do just fine. This gun does not get any help from its ammo, but it doesn't need it. You know, it's got an extremely high fire rate, high ergo, low weight, and it's cheap. It's cheap on the flea market right now because nobody's running 9mm. The MP5 and the MPX are pretty close neck and neck in my opinion. But it's still an A tier gun. The fire rate, even with a 9mm caliber in there, if you can hit a head, it's a pretty solid all-around choice, especially for a close quarters map. Our next A tier is the MP7A1. I really like the ammo, or what they've done with the ammo for the 4.6. So they buffed it a little bit. The subsonic ammo is what you want to field with this particular MP7 because the recoil is not quite as low as the standard MP7. So if you're using subsonic, that reduces the recoil by 22 or 24 or something like that. So you actually have a pretty decent weapon at that point from subsonic. This gun is pretty solid all around, very high fire rate, very accurate for an SMG. So it's a pretty good gun. Our next A tier gun is sadly the P90. I'm a huge P90 guy. I've run a P90 just about every wipe, but the recent changes in the ammo, as well as some of the buffs that some of the other SMGs have kind of dethroned it from S to A tier, in my opinion. It's mainly the changes to the SS190 and the SB193 ammo. There really isn't much of a point to run this gun over, say, an MP7, simply because the ammo is outperformed a little bit on both the AP round when compared to the FMJ and the subsonic round as well. So your subsonic round has better pen with the MP7, better damage. There just is no longer a reason to not run the MP7 if you have a choice between the MP7 and the P90. Moving on, our next S tier weapon is the Vector 45. I kind of hesitate to put this here because of how expensive 45 has gotten. It still shreds. I mean, you can't argue with 1,000 rounds per minute, especially at that caliber's performance. So, is it worth the cost to field the ammo? I've stopped using it, but I have been killed by it several times in the past couple weeks. It's still out there, it's still around, and when somebody's pointing one at you, it really seems like you very rarely get away unscathed. So I'm giving this one an S tier. And everybody's favorite this was an S tier, early wipe. Everybody's running this, but it's low fire rate, and the cost increase on the ammo have kind of bumped it down a little bit. It's probably an A+. It's kind of one of those ones that kind of hovers between the two. If you can deal with the low fire rate and you're wise about how you're employing the weapon, don't get yourself into a heads-up fight with like a VSS or a Vector or something. You can make the argument that this is an S tier weapon, but for most applications, I'm placing this in the A tier. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the assault rifle tier. So because this is such a long tier, I have taken the liberty of already adding the do not use guns, and I'm just going to simply state that if the weapon is in this category, it is for one of two reasons. One, it's absolute dog shit, or two, and more likely, is that there is some other kind of variant that is essentially the same thing, which performs better for less money. So this isn't going to take into account budget loadouts, like, for example, it's pretty cheap to go out and buy an AKMS, throw a butt pad on it, and go to town, in Shoreline for your kill quests with AKMs. This isn't that kind of tier maker. We're simply talking about, once a final build is done, cost versus lethality ratio. So not really taking into account budget runs too much when it can be avoided, especially with a gun with as many variants as the assault rifle category. So moving on, let's get into it. So the AK-101, actually pretty strong right now. 5.56 got a recent buff. 8.55A1 is performing very well. So this gun is currently A tier. It is a lower fire rate, of course. If you can get over that, this gun performs very well. The AK-103 in a C tier. I thought about putting this in the D tier because it's essentially a plastic version of the AKM, but you can modify it to a certain point to get it at least close to the AKM for around the same price. So I left it in the C tier. It's just a little bit more expensive, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The 74M is similar to that regard in that it's basically a copy of the N variant, except the N variant allows you to attach a better stock in the Zukov, so there really isn't a great reason to run a 74M unless you have to. Moving on from that, the AK-102 is the short version, so you'll notice in the AK-100 series that there's always a short variant. The AK-102 is the short version of the 101, which limits the type of handguards you can put onto it. Even though 8.55A1 has become strong, this isn't worth it because you just can't get the stats to where they need to be. The RD-704, everybody knows it. It's no secret. Right now, this weapon is sitting somewhere near the top, if not at the top of the current meta. Its slow fire rate is totally made up for kind of a silly high ergo. The dispersion stat on this gun is amazing, which you can't see in the interface, but yeah, hip firing this thing feels like you're cutting through butter. It's just a great gun all around, and it's not that expensive, even after they nerfed the ability to put it on the flea market. The 74N, I really wanted to put this gun higher. Because it feels pretty good. It feels pretty good. But again, that 545 bullet being just a little weaker than it should be, it just doesn't justify having a 38 recoil weapon. So you have a very similar weapon in terms of statistics between the 101 and the 74N. In fact, the 101 is basically a 74N made it with polymer parts and chambered for 5.56. So that being said, once the gun is fully modified, they're basically identical in terms of stats, but one's shooting a better bullet. So there's really no reason to use the 74N over a 101, at least not at this point. The differences are minuscule. You do get to put a Zukov on the 74N, but it doesn't make much of a difference because the bullet you're shooting out of the gun is just not as good. The AKM, I hate to keep putting this up at the top of the tiers because it annoyed me for so long that BP was just so effective, but can't argue with it. You just can't argue with the effectiveness of 7.62 by 39 BP. It just can't be done. So, you fully kit an AKM, you're going to get a solid gun time in and time out. The one change I can say for the better in this wipe is the Mutant. The Mutant's been toppled from the S tier in my opinion, and solely based on the cost. If this costed the same amount as the AK, we'd probably be putting it in the A tier again because the stats are relatively similar. But yeah, no, this is definitely A tier now based on the cost being higher. The RPK, it's kind of a weird gun. It's technically considered a light machine gun, but it doesn't really have anything else to be compared to in that class, so I'm putting it in the assault rifle category. I think that's a fair comparison. It is not in a good spot right now. It used to be, but it's not. You can't get this thing sub mid 50s recoil. I think it's like 53 or 54 tops, maybe 52. And then again, you're shooting that 5.45 round out of it, so it's just not as good as it should be. I know all you VSS and Val gamers are going to be kind of upset with me, but we're putting the VSS and the Val in the B tier, and this is largely based on cost. As well as a limited functionality of the gun. Okay, so if every map was a 50 by 50 meter cube, then fine. This gun is an S tier. But this is a CQB only weapon. Short mid range at best, and the cost of the ammo and say 3 30-round mags almost triples the cost of both of these guns. So it I don't know. People that run the VSS, making those VSS meta videos, they're ridiculous. They're just silly. Also, on that same token, I'm gonna take the Ash 12 down a peg as well. The Ash 12 has the same weaknesses as the VSS and the AS Val in that you can't really use it above 50 meters. I mean, you can, but its functionality is debatable at best. The ammo cost is extreme, especially after people caught on. Last wipe, using the Ash 12 when the PS12BE was easily attainable was a different story. Now it's pretty hard to get, cost is pretty high, so it's gone from an A tier weapon down to a B tier in my opinion. The only thing it's really good for is situational stuff like factory, hunting, killa, that sort of thing. The M4, this one's tough to grade because under normal circumstances, with where you can get this weapon, recoil and ergo wise, I would probably put this in the S tier. But it's so costly to build these properly that I'm gonna drop this down to the A tier. And prior to the recent changes in 855 A1, I would probably have put this in the B tier. So this is like a B plus A minus type of gun right now. So you want to keep an eye on the ammo changes, see if anything else comes loose or shakes loose. If 855 A1 takes another nerf or anything like that, this probably moves down to a B tier. The HK, however, right now it stands solidly at the top, I believe, as far as the 5.56 guns go. It got another buff. This gun has a better fire rate than the M4. It's cheaper to build. much cheaper to build actually. Only difference being, you know, your ergo is slightly lower once you get it all built out. I will be fielding an HK over an M4 pretty much any day of the week, just based on the cost and fire these days. So, you know, the MCX, I really wanted this gun to be better with the buffs that the Blackout received, but it just isn't. You know, the dispersion is it has one of the highest dispersion stats in the game of any assault rifle, if not the highest. Its convergence is high, but it doesn't really matter because you're sending the gun barrel all over the place when you shoot this gun to top it off. You know, the AP ammo adds even more recoil to it. So, you know, I tried it out. It just isn't. It's just not where it needs to be an A tier or even a B tier. It's a decent cost, like cost effective. It's okay. It's not too bad. You know, unless you're single tapping with this gun, it just isn't gonna get it done. The MDR 308. This gun is really strong. It's hard for me to place this one in the S tier just because it kicks so much. It's expensive. Ammo is expensive. You know, it's another one of these between tiers. A plus, S minus is a thing, right? I'm probably going to leave it in A just based on my personal preference, but I wouldn't be offended if you got upset with me for not putting it in S tier. I understand. The 5.56 MDR, however, is one of those guns I just don't understand why people use it. You know, if you don't want to build a gun, that's fine. I get it. It's easy. It's fast, but there's just so many better options in 5.56 out there. The Scar H is kind of the same situation as the 308 MDR. The Scar H hits hard, but you know, I have trouble controlling the recoil, so I'm gonna put this in the A tier. The Scar L is surprisingly good, guys. You should really give this gun a try, and we're probably one of the first gun build videos we do after this tier list is gonna be the Scar L, just because of how much I've been using it this wipe. And the reason I've been using it is because it has the lowest dispersion stat of any assault rifle in the game. So basically what that means, guys, is the angle at which the recoil takes away from center is greater the higher the number. So a low number is good. This means that you're sending the gun far less to the left and right based on that low number. High number bad, low number good. So the Scar L has the lowest number possible in the assault rifle category. So this means that despite it having what kind of looks like a ho-hum recoil number as far as vertical and horizontal goes, it's actually behaving like more like a 40 recoil gun. So that's something to keep in mind. Because of the low fire rate and 8.55 being 8.55, I'm going to put this gun in the A tier, but it does make a strong case for S tier, especially if 8.55 gets buffed or if this particular platform gets another buff as well. So the G36, guys, it's kind of surprising, actually. And I don't know if it's this cheap just because nobody uses it, but it's certainly possible. It is dirt cheap, even fully modded, which there aren't a whole lot of modifications for it. Anyway, it finishes around the same recoil as a Scar. It doesn't have quite as good of a dispersion stat, but it also has 100 rounds per minute higher fire rate. So it's really not that bad. It really isn't that bad. So yeah, play around with it, see if you like it. It's worth trying. It's kind of a good mid-range weapon, especially if you're looking for just a cheap budget gun to run. Just for God's sake, don't use the standard optic. Holy shit, is that thing bad. The FAL, man, I really liked the FAL a long time ago, but this thing has fallen so far. It needs to be retuned by BSG really, really badly. There are so many guns that are better right now that do the exact same thing. There's just no reason to run it, which makes me sad because I like the gun. That about does it for our Escape from Tarkov 12.12.30 weapon tier list. Hope you enjoyed the content. If you've made it this far, drop a like and a sub, and catch you on the next video. Also, feel free to stop by our Twitch. We're streaming just about every evening at Omni_actual on Twitch. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Peace.